The dust swirled around Jake's boots as he rode into the small frontier town of Cedar Ridge. The year was 1887, and the Arizona Territory was still wild and unforgiving. Jake Martinez had been riding for 3 days straight, chasing rumors of work on a cattle ranch. His horse, a sturdy brown mare named Stella, was tired but loyal. Jake's leather chaps were worn from years of hard work, and his hat bore the stains of countless storms. As he made his way down the main street, Jake noticed something strange. The town seemed too quiet for a Saturday afternoon. Most frontier towns would be bustling with activity, but Cedar Ridge felt like a ghost town. Only a few people moved along the wooden sidewalks, and they kept their heads down, avoiding eye contact with strangers. Jake stopped at the saloon and tied Stella to the hitching post. The building looked older than most, with paint peeling from its wooden sides. A sign that read "Lucky Dollar Saloon" creaked in the desert wind. Jake pushed through the swinging doors and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit by oil lamps, and the smell of whiskey and tobacco filled the air. Behind the bar stood a large man with graying hair and suspicious eyes. Only 3 other customers sat at tables, nursing their drinks in silence. Jake approached the bar and ordered a whiskey. The bartender poured the drink without saying a word, but his eyes never left Jake's face. "Quiet town you got here," Jake said, trying to make conversation. The bartender grunted. "That's how we like it." Jake sipped his whiskey and looked around the room. In the corner, he noticed a young woman sitting alone at a table. She wore a simple blue dress that had seen better days, and her long black hair was pulled back in a braid. What caught Jake's attention was the fear in her dark eyes. She kept glancing toward the door as if expecting trouble to walk through at any moment. The woman's hand shook slightly as she lifted her cup of coffee to her lips. Jake could see bruises on her wrists, partially hidden by the sleeves of her dress. Something about her reminded him of his own sister back in Texas, and he felt a protective instinct stir in his chest. Before Jake could decide whether to approach her, the saloon doors burst open. 3 men entered, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The leader was a tall, thin man with cold blue eyes and a scar running from his left ear to his jaw. His 2 companions were shorter but looked just as dangerous. All 3 wore guns on their hips, and their clothes suggested they had money and power. Well, the scarred man said, his voice carrying a threat. "If it isn't little Maria Santos drinking coffee like she owns the place." The young woman named Maria shrank back in her chair. Her coffee cup rattled against the saucer as her hands trembled even more. "Please, Mr. Blackwood," she whispered. "I'm not causing any trouble." The man called Blackwood laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, but you are causing trouble, sweetheart. Your family owes me money and time's running out." Jake watched the scene unfold, his jaw clenching. He had seen bullies before, and he knew the type. Blackwood was the kind of man who used fear to control others. Probably the richest and most powerful person in this small town. The way everyone else in the saloon avoided looking at the confrontation told Jake that this was a common occurrence. "My father is trying to get the money," Maria said, her voice barely audible. "He just needs more time. The drought killed most of our cattle and—" "Excuses," Blackwood interrupted, stepping closer to her table. "Your daddy has had plenty of time. 3 months, to be exact. The debt was supposed to be paid last week." One of Blackwood's men, a stocky fellow with a thick mustache, cracked his knuckles. "Maybe we should pay the Santos place a visit, boss. Help them understand the situation better." Maria's eyes widened with terror. "No, please. My little brothers and sisters live there. They're just children. Don't hurt them." Blackwood smiled coldly. "Then perhaps you can convince your father to be more cooperative. Or maybe you can find another way to pay what's owed." The implication in his words made Jake's blood boil. He had finished his whiskey, but he stayed seated, listening and watching. Something told him this situation was about to get much worse before it got better. "I don't have any money," Maria said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "We lost everything in the drought. The bank won't lend us anything more." "Money isn't the only form of payment," Blackwood said, reaching out to touch Maria's hair. She flinched away from his hand. "A pretty girl like you could be very useful to me. I've been looking for someone to keep house for me, among other things." Maria stood up quickly, knocking over her coffee cup. The brown liquid spread across the table and dripped onto the floor. "I would never, you would never what?" Blackwood's voice turned dangerous. "You're in no position to refuse anything, girl. Your family owes me $2,000. That's more money than your father will see in 5 years of honest work. Jake nearly choked on the last of his whiskey. $2,000 was an enormous sum for a small ranching family. Most cowboys made about $30 a month, so this debt represented years of wages. No wonder Maria looked so frightened. Please, Maria begged, backing toward the wall. Give us just a little more time. I'll work extra hours at the general store. I'll do anything honest to help pay the debt. Blackwood's two companions spread out, blocking Maria's path to the door. The scarred man stepped even closer, and Jake could see Maria pressing herself against the wall, trying to get as far away from him as possible. Honest work won't pay this debt fast enough, Blackwood said. But I'm a reasonable man. I'll make you a deal. Come work for me personally, and I'll consider your family's debt reduced. You'll have a roof over your head, food to eat, and your family won't have to worry about collectors. The entire saloon had gone silent except for the sound of Maria's frightened breathing. Even the bartender had stopped wiping glasses and stood frozen behind the bar. Jake realized that everyone in the room knew exactly what kind of work Blackwood was offering, and none of them were willing or able to intervene. Maria's voice was so quiet that Jake had to strain to hear her next words. What about my family? What happens to them? They keep their land, their house, their livestock, Blackwood said. All they have to do is forget they have a daughter named Maria. The cruelty of the offer hit Jake like a physical blow. Blackwood was essentially asking Maria to sacrifice herself to save her family, and everyone in the room knew she had no choice. This was how men like Blackwood operated in small frontier towns. They used debt and fear to get whatever they wanted, knowing that decent people had no way to fight back. Jake finished his drink and quietly placed a coin on the bar. His mind was racing, trying to think of a way to help without making the situation worse for Maria and her family. Maria looked around the saloon desperately, her eyes finally meeting Jake's across the room. For just a moment, their gazes locked, and Jake saw something in her expression that broke his heart. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was the look of someone about to make an impossible sacrifice. I need time to think, Maria whispered. Though everyone in the room knew she was just delaying the inevitable, Blackwood chuckled and checked his pocket watch. You have exactly 1 minute to decide, sweetheart. After that, my boys and I will ride out to your family's ranch for a little conversation with your father. I hear your youngest sister is only 8 years old. Such a shame when children get caught in their parents' mistakes. The threat against Maria's little sister was the final straw for Jake. He had grown up in a family of 6 children, and the thought of anyone threatening a child made his blood burn. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Every eye in the saloon turned toward him. Seems like a pretty one-sided conversation you're having there, Jake said calmly, his hand resting near his gun belt. Blackwood turned to face him, his cold eyes sizing up this unexpected interference. This doesn't concern you, stranger. I suggest you finish your drink and ride on out of town. Well, that's the thing, Jake said, taking a step closer. I was planning to do exactly that, but then I heard you threatening women and children. Where I come from, that's the kind of thing that does concern a man. The 2 men with Blackwood immediately moved their hands to their guns, but Jake didn't seem worried. Years of working cattle drives and dealing with outlaws had taught him to read dangerous men. And while these 3 were certainly ruthless, they weren't the fastest guns he had ever faced. You don't know who you're messing with. Cowboy, the stocky man with the mustache, warned. Mr. Blackwood owns half this town, and the other half is too scared to stand up to him, Jake replied. I can see that. But I'm not from this town, and I'm not scared of any man who picks fights with young ladies. Blackwood's scar seemed to darken as his face flushed with anger. You're making a very big mistake, friend. I've got 20 men who work for me. You're just one drifter passing through. Jake smiled, but his eyes remained deadly serious. Maybe so. But right now it's 3 against 1 in here, and I like those odds just fine. Maria watched this exchange with growing amazement and terror. This stranger was risking his life for her, someone he had never met. She wanted to tell him to leave, to save himself, but the words wouldn't come. For the first time in months, someone was standing up to Blackwood, and she felt a tiny spark of hope. What exactly are you proposing, stranger? Blackwood asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Simple, Jake said. The lady walks out of here unmolested, and you and your boys find something else to do with your afternoon. And the debt her family owes me? Jake considered this for a moment. That's between you and her father, but it gets settled like civilized people, not with threats against children. Blackwood laughed again, and this time his companions joined in. You really don't understand the situation here, do you? This isn't the big city where people call the sheriff when there's trouble. I am the law in Cedar Ridge. The sheriff works for me, the judge is my cousin, and most of the businessmen owe me money. Then it sounds like this town could use some cleaning up, Jake said. The tension in the room was so thick it could be cut with a knife. The bartender had quietly moved toward the back door, ready to run if shooting started. The other customers had already slipped out, leaving only Jake, Maria, and Blackwood's group in the saloon. Tell you what, Cowboy, Blackwood said, his voice turning smooth and calculating. You seem like a man who appreciates a good wager. How about we settle this with a game of cards? If you win, the girl goes free and I give her family an extra month to pay their debt. And if you win? Jake asked. If I win, you ride out of town and never come back. And the girl comes with me tonight. Maria gasped and shook her head. No, please. Don't gamble with my life, but Jake was already nodding. What kind of game? 5-card stud, one hand, winner takes all, Blackwood said. But I choose the deck and my man shuffles. Jake knew this was likely a trap. In a crooked town like Cedar Ridge, Blackwood probably had marked cards or other ways to cheat. But he also knew that Maria had no other options, and sometimes a man had to take a risk to do what was right. Agreed? Jake said. But we play right here, in front of everyone, and the lady holds the stakes. Blackwood nodded to the stocky man who produced a deck of cards from his vest pocket. The cards looked new, but Jake noticed they had been handled quite a bit. Probably marked just as he had suspected. They sat down at Maria's table after she quickly cleaned up the spilled coffee with a rag from the bar. Her hands were still shaking, but she managed to clear the surface. Jake could smell her perfume, something floral that reminded him of wildflowers back home in Texas. You don't have to do this, Maria whispered to Jake as Blackwood's man shuffled the cards. Yes, I do, Jake replied quietly. Some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are stacked against you. Blackwood's man dealt 5 cards to each player. Jake picked up his hand slowly, keeping his face completely neutral. He had been playing cards since he was 12 years old, and he knew how to hide his thoughts. His hand was decent but not great. A pair of jacks, a 10, a 7, and a 4. Blackwood looked at his cards and smiled slightly. That small expression told Jake everything he needed to know. His opponent either had a very good hand or was confident in his ability to cheat. Your bet, stranger, Blackwood said. The stakes are already set, Jake replied. Well, let's see what you've got. Blackwood laid down his cards with a flourish, a full house, aces over kings. It was an extremely strong hand, and the odds of getting it naturally were very small. Jake was certain now that the game was rigged. Looks like you lose, Cowboy, Blackwood said, reaching across the table toward Maria's arm. Time to collect my winnings. But Jake didn't put down his cards immediately. Instead, he looked directly into Maria's frightened eyes and made a decision that would change everything. Actually, Jake said calmly, I think there might be a problem with this game. Blackwood's hand froze halfway to Maria's arm. What kind of problem? The kind where a man tries to cheat an honest cowboy, Jake said, finally laying down his cards. The silence in the room was deafening as everyone stared at Jake's hand. Against all odds? He was holding 4 aces and a king, a hand that was virtually impossible to beat and even more impossible to get honestly in the same game where someone else held a full house with aces. Jake had switched his cards. The silence stretched for what felt like hours. Blackwood stared at Jake's 4 aces, his face turning red with fury. He knew he had been caught cheating, but more importantly, he knew that Jake had somehow managed to out-cheat him. In the lawless world of frontier justice, this was both impressive and extremely dangerous. That's impossible, the stocky man with the mustache growled. Reaching for his gun, Jake's hand moved faster than lightning, drawing his Colt .45 and pointing it directly at the man's chest. I wouldn't do that if I were you, partner. Maria pressed herself against the wall, watching this deadly confrontation unfold. She had never seen anyone move as fast as Jake, and she realized that this mysterious cowboy was far more dangerous than he appeared. You switched the cards, Blackwood accused. His voice shaking with rage, Jake smiled coldly. Prove it. It was a perfect challenge because everyone in the room knew that Blackwood had been planning to cheat all along. If he accused Jake of switching cards, he would have to admit that the original game was rigged. In a town where reputation meant everything, even a corrupt man like Blackwood couldn't afford to be seen as a cheater who had been beaten at his own game. The bet was 5-card stud. One hand, winner takes all, Jake continued, his gun never wavering. I won fair and square using the same deck you provided. The lady goes free, and her family gets an extra month to pay their debt. Blackwood's 2 men looked to their boss for guidance, but he was trapped. If he ordered them to start shooting, people would ask questions about why the card game had gone wrong. If he accepted the loss, he would look weak in front of his men and anyone else who heard the story. This isn't over, Blackwood finally said, standing up slowly. Nobody makes a fool of me in my own town. I didn't make a fool of you, Jake replied, holstering his gun but keeping his hand ready. You did that all by yourself when you decided to threaten women and children. As Blackwood and his men headed for the door, the scarred man turned back one more time. Enjoy your victory, stranger. But remember, you can't watch your back forever. After they left, the saloon remained quiet for several minutes. The bartender finally returned from wherever he had been hiding, and Maria slowly sat back down at the table. Her legs felt weak, and she could hardly believe what had just happened. You saved me, she whispered, looking at Jake with wonder and gratitude. Jake sat down across from her and gathered up the cards. Maybe for now. But men like Blackwood don't give up easily. You and your family are still in danger. Maria's brief moment of hope began to fade. You're right. He'll find another way to get what he wants. And next time there won't be a brave stranger here to help. Tell me about your family's situation, Jake said. How did you end up owing Blackwood so much money? Maria sighed deeply and the whole story came pouring out. Her father, Manuel Santos, had borrowed money from Blackwood 2 years ago to expand their cattle ranch. The loan had seemed reasonable at the time, with manageable monthly payments. But then the drought hit, lasting for 18 months and killing most of their cattle. Without cows to sell, they couldn't make their payments. Papa tried everything, Maria explained. He sold our horses, our equipment, even my mother's jewelry. But it wasn't enough. Blackwood charges interest that keeps growing every month. Now we owe twice what Papa originally borrowed. What about the bank? Jake asked. Surely they could help restructure the loan. Maria laughed bitterly. Blackwood owns the bank. He owns everything in this town. The general store where I work, the grain mill, most of the houses people rent. Anyone who speaks against him finds themselves without a job or a place to live. Jake was beginning to understand the scope of Blackwood's control over Cedar Ridge. It was a classic setup, one powerful man using debt and economic pressure to control an entire community. He had seen similar situations in other frontier towns, and they rarely ended well without outside intervention. What about your sheriff? Surely there's some law in this territory. Sheriff Davidson is Blackwood's cousin, Maria said. He does whatever he's told. The few times people have tried to complain about Blackwood's methods, they've been arrested for disturbing the peace or making false accusations. Jake rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. The situation was worse than he had initially thought. Blackwood had created a perfect system of control, and breaking it would require more than just one gunfight in a saloon. How many people in town would stand up to Blackwood if they thought they could win? Jake asked. I don't know, Maria admitted. People are scared. Most of them owe him money or depend on him for work. But I know some of them hate what he's doing. Mr. Peterson, who runs the livery stable, the widow Mrs. Johnson, who owns the boarding house, maybe a few of the smaller ranchers outside of town. That's a start, Jake said. But first we need to deal with your immediate problem. Blackwood isn't going to honor our card game agreement for very long. Maria nodded sadly. I know, tomorrow or the next day he'll come up with some excuse to demand payment again. And when Papa can't pay, then you'll need to disappear for a while, Jake said. Maria's eyes widened. Leave my family? I can't do that. They need me. They need you alive and free more than they need you here, Jake pointed out. If Blackwood takes you, what happens to your brothers and sisters then? It was a harsh truth, but Maria knew he was right. As long as she remained in Cedar Ridge, she would be a target. Blackwood would keep using her as leverage against her father, making the family's situation impossible. But where would I go? She asked. I don't have any money and I don't know anyone outside of this town. Jake made a decision that surprised even himself. You could come with me. Maria stared at him in shock. What? I'm heading south toward Tucson, Jake explained. There's work there, and Blackwood's reach doesn't extend that far. You could start fresh, maybe send money back to help your family once you're established. But I don't even know your name, Maria protested. Jake Martinez, he said with a slight smile. "And I know yours is Maria Santos. Sometimes that's enough to start with." Maria felt her heart racing. This stranger, Jake, was offering her a way out of an impossible situation. But leaving with a man she had just met was dangerous in its own way. What did she really know about him other than that he was brave and good with cards and guns? "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Of course," Jake agreed. "But don't think too long. I have a feeling Blackwood is planning something for tonight or tomorrow morning. Men like him don't like to be embarrassed, especially in front of their own people." As if to prove Jake's point, the sound of horses could be heard outside the saloon. Both Jake and Maria moved to the window and peered through the dusty glass. Blackwood and at least 6 armed men were riding past, heading in the direction of the Santos ranch. "They're going to see my father now," Maria said, her face pale with worry. Jake cursed under his breath. He had hoped they would have more time to plan, but Blackwood was moving faster than expected. The card game had bought them a few hours at most, not the days they needed to figure out a real solution. "We need to get to your family's ranch," Jake said, checking his guns and ammunition. "If we're lucky, we can get there before things go too far." Maria was already moving toward the door. "It's 5 miles north of town. Do you have a fast horse?" "Fast enough," Jake said. "But Maria, you should know, if we do this, there's no going back. Blackwood will never forgive either of us." Maria paused at the saloon doors, looking back at Jake. In that moment, she made the decision that would change her life forever. "I'll be your prisoner, just protect my kin," she whispered. Jake stopped dead in his tracks, stunned by Maria's words. "What did you say?" Maria's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. "I said I'll be your prisoner, just protect my kin. I know what kind of life I'm choosing if I go with you. I'll be completely dependent on your mercy, traveling with a stranger into unknown territory. But if that's what it takes to keep my family safe from Blackwood, then that's what I'll do." The weight of her sacrifice hit Jake like a physical blow. She wasn't just asking him to help her escape. She was offering to bind herself to him completely, trusting him with her life and her future. In the harsh reality of the frontier, a woman traveling alone with a man was essentially his property, whether by choice or not. "Maria, that's not what I meant when I offered to help you," Jake said softly. "You wouldn't be my prisoner. You'd be under my protection, but as a free person." "Would I?" Maria asked, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Really? A Mexican woman with no money, no family nearby, no place to go except where you take me. Even if you're a good man, and I pray to God you are, I would still be completely at your mercy." Jake realized she was right. In 1887 Arizona, a woman in Maria's position would have virtually no rights or options. Society would assume she was either his wife, his mistress, or his servant. There was no category for a woman traveling as an equal partner with a man she barely knew. "Then we need to find another way," Jake said firmly. "I won't accept that kind of arrangement." "There is no other way," Maria replied, moving toward the door again. "Not if we want to save my family. Every minute we spend talking, Blackwood gets closer to my home." Jake followed her outside, his mind racing. The afternoon sun was starting to sink toward the western horizon, painting the dusty street in shades of gold and orange. Stella waited patiently at the hitching post, but Jake could see other horses tied up around town, probably belonging to more of Blackwood's men. "How many men does Blackwood usually travel with?" Jake asked as they hurried toward his horse. "It depends on what he's doing," Maria said, trying to keep up with Jake's long strides. "For something like this, probably 8 or 10. He likes to make sure people feel outnumbered and helpless." Jake untied Stella and checked his rifle, which was secured to his saddle. "Can you ride?" "Yes, but I don't have a horse." Jake looked around quickly and spotted a decent-looking chestnut mare tied outside the general store. "That one will have to do. We'll send payment back to the owner later." "You want to steal a horse?" Maria asked, shocked. "I want to borrow a horse to save lives," Jake corrected. "Sometimes a man has to choose between following the law and doing what's right." Maria hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She had already decided to trust Jake with her life. Trusting him with this smaller decision seemed easy by comparison. They quickly untied the chestnut mare, and Jake helped Maria into the saddle. She rode side saddle, as was proper for a lady, but Jake could tell she was comfortable with horses. They rode hard toward the Santos ranch, pushing their horses as fast as they dared on the rough terrain. The trail wound through scrub brush and rocky outcroppings, with occasional glimpses of the desert mountains in the distance. Jake kept his eyes on the horizon, looking for signs of Blackwood's group. As they crested a small hill about 2 miles from town, Jake spotted what he was looking for. In the distance, a cloud of dust marked the passage of multiple riders heading in the same direction they were going. Blackwood's men were making good time, but Jake and Maria still had a chance to reach the ranch first. There, Jake pointed toward the dust cloud. How much farther to your home? Maybe 3 miles, Maria said, urging her borrowed horse to go faster. But Jake, what are we going to do when we get there? You're just one man against all of Blackwood's guns. I'm working on that, Jake said grimly. The truth was, he didn't have a complete plan yet, but years of working cattle drives and dealing with dangerous situations had taught him that sometimes you had to act first and figure out the details later. The most important thing was to prevent Blackwood from threatening Maria's family with no witnesses around. As they rode, Maria told Jake more about her family. Her father Manuel was 53 years old, a proud man who had worked hard his entire life to build the ranch. Her mother had died 3 years earlier from pneumonia, leaving Manuel to raise 5 children alone. Besides Maria, there were 4 younger siblings: Carlos, 16, Elena, 14, Miguel, 12, and little Rosa, who had just turned 8. Papa tries so hard to take care of everyone, Maria explained, tears streaming down her face from the wind and her emotions. When Mama died, he borrowed money from Blackwood to pay for her medical expenses and the funeral. Then he borrowed more to expand the ranch, thinking he could make enough money to support all of us and pay back the loans. What about your brothers? Jake asked. Are they old enough to help fight? Carlos thinks he is, Maria said. But he's just a boy, really. He's hot-headed and brave, but he's never been in a real fight. If Blackwood's men threaten him, he'll try to fight back and they'll hurt him. Jake understood. A 16-year-old boy would feel obligated to defend his family, especially with his father outnumbered. But untrained courage against experienced gunmen usually ended in tragedy. They pushed their horses even harder, and finally, the Santos Ranch came into view. It was a modest operation, a small adobe house with a red tile roof, a barn, some corrals and pastures that showed the effects of the long drought. A few cattle grazed in the distance, but nowhere near enough to support a family of 6. Jake could see people moving around the house and yard, but no sign yet of Blackwood's group. They had made it in time, but probably not by much. Maria, a young voice called out as they approached. A boy who looked like a younger version of Maria came running from the barn. This had to be Carlos. What are you doing here? Carlos asked, looking suspiciously at Jake. And who is this man? Before Maria could answer, an older man emerged from the house. Manuel Santos was tall and lean, with graying hair and weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. His resemblance to Maria was unmistakable, but where she looked frightened, he looked tired and defeated. Maria, you should not be here, Manuel said in accented English, clearly intending for Jake to understand. It is dangerous. Papa, this is Jake Martinez, Maria said quickly. He helped me in town. Blackwood is coming here with many men. We need to be ready. Manuel's face grew even more grave. How many men? At least 8, Jake said, dismounting from Stella. Maybe more. They're about 10 minutes behind us. Carlos immediately started toward the house. I'll get the rifle. Wait, Jake said firmly. Before anyone does anything, we need to talk. All of us. As if summoned by his words, the rest of the Santos family appeared. Elena was a pretty girl who looked like a younger version of Maria. Miguel was a serious-faced boy with intelligent eyes, and little Rosa clung to Elena's skirt, sensing the tension in the air. Listen carefully, Jake said, addressing the whole family. Blackwood is coming here to pressure you about the debt. He's going to threaten you, and he might try to take Maria by force. We need to be smart about how we handle this. Manuel's shoulders sagged. What choice do we have? I cannot pay what I owe. If he takes Maria... The older man couldn't finish the sentence. He's not taking anyone, Jake said firmly. But I need you to trust me, and I need everyone to do exactly what I say. Carlos bristled. You don't give orders here, stranger. This is our family, our land. Jake looked at the boy with understanding, but also firmness. You're right. This is your family and your land. But I've dealt with men like Blackwood before, and you haven't. If you want to protect your sisters, you'll listen to what I have to say. In the distance, the sound of approaching horses could be heard. Blackwood and his men would be there within minutes, and Jake still hadn't figured out how to protect an entire family against overwhelming odds. Blackwood's face turned red with rage, but Jake's words had created a legal and moral trap. In the rough justice of the frontier, there was a significant difference between collecting a legitimate debt and kidnapping a woman. Even Blackwood's own men would hesitate to cross that line, especially with witnesses present. "Fine," Blackwood said through gritted teeth. "Take the girl, but the debt still stands and I want payment within 30 days. If Santos can't pay, I'll take this ranch and everything on it." 30 days, Jake agreed. "But at legal interest rates, not the loan sharking terms you've been charging?" Blackwood holstered his gun with a violent motion. "We'll see about that when the time comes. Enjoy your month, Santos. It'll be your last on this land." As Blackwood and his men rode away, Jake felt the tension drain from his body. They had won this confrontation, but the war was far from over. 30 days wasn't much time to solve a $2,000 problem. Manuel Santos approached Jake with tears in his eyes. "Senor Martinez, I don't know how to thank you. You saved my daughter and gave my family hope." "The fight isn't over yet," Jake warned. "We bought time, but we still need to find a real solution." Carlos lowered his rifle, his hands shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. "What happens now? How do we pay that much money in 30 days? Jake looked around at the Santos ranch, his experienced eye evaluating the land and resources. "Tell me about that railroad survey Maria mentioned. When exactly did they come through here?" "About 6 weeks ago," Manuel replied. "They were very interested in this valley. Something about the grade being perfect for laying track? And Blackwood knew about this when he started pressuring you for immediate payment?" "I think so. He's been asking a lot of questions about whether I'd be willing to sell the land." Jake nodded grimly, just as I thought. "This whole debt crisis is manufactured. Blackwood wants your land because he knows the railroad is coming through. Once they announce the route, property values will skyrocket." Maria had come down from the porch and was standing beside her father. "But how does that help us? We still owe the money." "Maybe we don't," Jake said. "If we can prove that Blackwood has been charging illegal interest rates, the entire debt might be invalidated. And if we can show that he's been manipulating the situation to force you off valuable land, we might have a case for fraud." Elena emerged from the house with Miguel and Rosa. "But who would we take such a case to? You said yourself that Blackwood controls the local law." "The territorial government," Jake said. "There's a federal judge in Tucson who handles cases involving territorial law violations. If we can get evidence of fraud and usury, he'll have jurisdiction over Blackwood regardless of local politics." Hope began to dawn on the faces of the Santos family, but Jake held up a cautioning hand. "It won't be easy. We'll need documentation, witnesses, proof of the railroad survey's value assessment, and we'll have to get to Tucson and back within 30 days. "I'll go with you," Carlos said immediately. "No," Jake replied firmly. "You need to stay here and protect your family. Blackwood might try something while we're gone." "We?" Maria asked. Jake looked at her seriously. "You made an agreement with me, remember? You said you'd be my prisoner to protect your family. Well, I need you to come to Tucson with me. You're the primary witness to Blackwood's threats and illegal demands." Maria felt her stomach flutter with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Traveling to Tucson with Jake would mean being alone with him for days, completely dependent on his protection and honor. It was exactly the scenario she had described as making her his prisoner. "How long would we be gone?" she asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3, Jake estimated. "It's a hard ride to Tucson and legal proceedings take time." Manuel looked troubled. "Maria, you cannot travel alone with a man who is not your husband. People will talk. Your reputation—" "Papa," Maria said gently. "My reputation is already ruined just by being associated with Blackwood's threats. And if we lose the ranch, what does reputation matter anyway?" Jake understood the older man's concerns. In Mexican culture, family honor was extremely important, and an unmarried daughter traveling with a strange man would cause scandal. But desperate times sometimes required desperate measures. "There might be another option," Jake said slowly. "We could travel as husband and wife." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone stared at Jake, trying to understand what he was suggesting. "You mean pretend to be married?" Maria asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I mean actually get married," Jake said. "It would solve the reputation problem, give you legal protection, and ensure that any property we might recover would belong to the family." Maria's head spun. This morning she had been a frightened young woman facing an impossible choice. Now a stranger was proposing marriage as a business arrangement to save her family's ranch. "You would marry me just to help with the legal case?" she asked, trying to understand his motives. Jake met her eyes directly. "I'd marry you because it's the right thing to do, and because—" He paused, struggling with words. "Because in the few hours I've known you, I've seen more courage and loyalty than I've seen in most people's entire lives. You were willing to sacrifice yourself for your family. That's the kind of woman a man would be honored to call his wife." Maria felt tears starting again, but this time they weren't tears of fear. This man, this stranger who had risked his life for her, was offering her not just protection but genuine partnership. "But you don't love me," she said softly, "and I don't love you. How can we build a marriage on that?" "Love can grow," Jake said simply. "But respect and trust are good foundations to start with. And I already respect and trust you more than most people I've known for years." Manuel stepped forward. "Señor Martinez, you have been more than generous already. I cannot ask you to marry my daughter just to help our family." "You're not asking," Jake replied. "I'm offering. But the decision has to be Maria's." All eyes turned to Maria. She looked at her family, her father's weathered face, Carlos trying to look grown up and protective, Elena holding little Rosa, Miguel watching everything with serious eyes. Then she looked at Jake, this mysterious cowboy who had appeared in her life like an answered prayer. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "what kind of marriage would it be? Would you expect? Would I be required to—" She couldn't finish the question, but Jake understood. "You would be my wife in name and in law," he said gently. "Anything beyond that would be entirely your choice in your own time. I'm not Blackwood. I don't take what isn't freely given." Maria nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and strange disappointment. Part of her, a part she didn't want to examine too closely, had been hoping he might say something different. "How long would we need to stay married?" she asked. "Until the legal case is resolved and your family is safe," Jake said. "After that, if you want an annulment or divorce, I'll help you get it." Maria looked around at her family one more time. They were all watching her with hope and worry, waiting for her to make a decision that would affect all their lives. "All right," she said finally. "I'll marry you, Jake Martinez. But I have one condition." "What's that?" "Promise me that no matter what happens, you'll make sure my family keeps this land. Even if it costs you everything. Even if it costs you your life." Jake looked at this brave young woman who was willing to bind herself to a stranger to save the people she loved. "I promise," he said solemnly. "Whatever it takes." The wedding took place 3 days later in the small church at the edge of Cedar Ridge. Father Miguel, an elderly priest who had known the Santos family for years, performed the ceremony with a mixture of blessing and concern. He understood the desperate circumstances that had led to this unusual union, but he also saw something in the way Jake and Maria looked at each other that gave him hope. Maria wore her mother's white dress, carefully preserved and altered by Elena to fit her perfectly. Jake had purchased a new shirt and vest from the general store, using some of his carefully hoarded traveling money. They made a handsome couple, even under the strange circumstances of their marriage. The only guests were the Santos family, and a few brave townspeople who had quietly supported them against Blackwood's tyranny. Mrs. Peterson from the livery stable was there, along with the widow Johnson and 3 of the smaller ranchers from outside town. Word of Jake's confrontation with Blackwood had spread quickly, and these people saw the wedding as a symbol of resistance against the man who had controlled their lives for too long. As they exchanged vows, Maria found herself studying Jake's face. He spoke the words of commitment seriously, as if he truly meant them, not just as a legal convenience. When he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, another purchase from his dwindling funds, she felt a strange warmth in her chest. "You may kiss the bride," Father Miguel announced. Jake leaned forward carefully and kissed Maria gently on the lips. It was brief and respectful, but Maria felt her heart race nonetheless. She was now Maria Martinez, wife of a man she had known for less than a week. After the ceremony, there was a small celebration at the Santos ranch. Elena and Carlos had prepared a feast with what little food they could spare, and the wedding guests brought contributions of their own. For a few hours, it was possible to forget about Blackwood and debts and the uncertain future. As the sun began to set, Jake and Maria prepared for their journey to Tucson. They would travel light and fast with minimal supplies and maximum urgency. Every day they delayed gave Blackwood more time to strengthen his position or create new obstacles. "Take care of each other," Manuel said, embracing his daughter and new son-in-law. "And remember, the land is important, but you are more important. Don't take risks that might cost your lives." Carlos shook Jake's hand solemnly. "Protect my sister," he said. "She's the strongest person I know, but she's also the most trusting. Don't let anyone take advantage of that." Jake nodded. "I'll guard her with my life." As they rode away from the ranch, Maria felt as if she was leaving one life behind and entering another completely unknown existence. She was now married to a man who was still largely a mystery to her, traveling toward a city she had never seen, to pursue a legal case that might be impossible to win. "Are you having second thoughts?" Jake asked as they settled into a steady pace on the trail south. "Every minute," Maria admitted, "but that doesn't mean I made the wrong choice." They rode in comfortable silence for several miles, both lost in their own thoughts. The desert landscape gradually changed around them as they moved away from the familiar territory around Cedar Ridge. The mountains took on different shapes. The vegetation became more sparse, and the very air seemed to carry the promise of adventure and danger. On their second day of travel, they encountered their first real test. A group of 4 men on horseback approached them from the east, riding hard and looking like trouble. Jake immediately moved closer to Maria and loosened his gun in its holster. "Afternoon, folks," the leader of the group called out as they drew near. He was a big man with a thick beard and clothes that had seen too many fights. "Nice day for traveling." "It is indeed," Jake replied carefully, keeping his voice friendly but alert. "Mighty pretty lady you got there," the bearded man continued, his eyes fixed on Maria in a way that made her skin crawl. "Wouldn't want anything to happen to her on these dangerous roads." Jake recognized the threat immediately. These were highway robbers, probably working in cooperation with Blackwood, or at least aware that Jake and Maria were carrying money for their legal case. "We're just a married couple heading to Tucson," Jake said mildly. "Nothing valuable worth your time?" "Oh, I think you might be surprised what we'd find valuable," the bearded man said with an ugly grin. "Why don't you and your missus step down from them horses so we can have a proper conversation?" Maria felt terror rising in her throat, but she also felt something else, a fierce determination not to let these men stop them from saving her family. She had married Jake partly for his protection, and now she was about to see what kind of man she had bound her life to. "I don't think that's necessary," Jake said, his voice becoming colder. "We'll just be moving along now." The 4 robbers spread out to surround them, hands moving toward their weapons. The leader laughed. "I don't think you understand the situation here, friend. We're not asking." What happened next would stay burned in Maria's memory for the rest of her life. Jake's transformation from mild-mannered traveler to deadly gunfighter was so sudden and complete that it took her breath away. His Colt was in his hand and firing before any of the robbers could clear leather. The leader toppled from his horse with a bullet through his chest. Jake's second shot took down the man to their left before he could aim his rifle. The third robber managed to get off a wild shot that whistled past Maria's ear. But Jake's return fire was precise and final. The fourth man, seeing his companions fall, wheeled his horse around and rode away as fast as he could. Jake let him go, watching until he disappeared into the desert scrub. "Are you hurt?" Jake asked immediately, turning to check on Maria. She shook her head, though she was trembling from shock and adrenaline. "I've never seen anyone. How did you—" "Experience," Jake said grimly, reloading his gun with practiced efficiency. "I spent 5 years working cattle drives through Comanche territory. You learn to shoot fast and straight or you don't survive." As they continued their journey, Maria found herself looking at her new husband with different eyes. She had married him thinking he was simply a brave cowboy with good intentions. Now she realized he was something much more dangerous and capable than she had imagined. "Jake," she said as they made camp that evening, "who are you really? I mean, what's your story? Where did you come from?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, poking at their small campfire with a stick. "I was born in Texas," he said finally. "My family had a small ranch outside San Antonio. When I was 18, Comanche raiders attacked our place. They killed my parents and 2 of my sisters. My brother Miguel and I survived because we were out checking on the cattle." Maria's heart ached for him. "I'm sorry. That must have been terrible." Miguel and I tried to keep the ranch going, but we were too young and had too many debts. We lost everything within 2 years. Miguel headed to California to try his luck in the goldfields. I became a drifter, working cattle drives, doing odd jobs, never staying in one place too long. Why? Maria asked gently. Jake looked at her across the firelight. Because every time I started to care about a place or people, something bad happened to them. I figured it was safer for everyone if I kept moving. But you stopped for me, for my family. Yeah, Jake said softly. I did. Why? Jake was quiet for so long that Maria thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because when I saw you in that saloon, standing up to Blackwood even though you were terrified, you reminded me of my sister Elena. She was about your age when she died, and she had the same kind of courage. I couldn't save her, but maybe I could save you. Maria felt tears stinging her eyes. Is that all I am to you? A chance to make up for the past? Jake looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw something that made her breath catch. That's how it started, he said honestly. But it's not how it is now. How is it now? Now, Jake said, I think I'm falling in love with my wife. The words hung between them in the desert night, changing everything. Maria felt her heart pounding as she realized that her feelings for Jake had been growing too, even though she had been afraid to admit it. Jake, she whispered. I know it's too soon, he said quickly. I know this marriage was supposed to be just business, just to help your family. You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know. But Maria was already moving around the fire toward him. When she reached his side, she took his face in her hands and kissed him with all the emotion and gratitude and growing love that she had been holding back. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. I think, Maria said softly, that I'm falling in love with my husband too. 3 weeks later, they returned to Cedar Ridge as a real married couple, with legal documents that would destroy Blackwood's fraudulent claims and save the Santos Ranch. But more importantly, they returned with something neither of them had expected to find: true love, born from sacrifice and strengthened by shared danger. Blackwood never bothered the Santos family again. Faced with federal charges for usury and fraud, he fled the territory and was never seen in Arizona again. The railroad did come through the valley, making the Santos Ranch worth 10 times its original value. Jake and Maria built a house on the edge of the family property, where they raised 4 children and lived happily for 57 years. And every year on their wedding anniversary, Maria would whisper the words that had started it all. I'll be your prisoner. Just protect my kin. But by then they both knew that neither of them was anyone's prisoner. They were partners, equals, and most importantly, they were in love.